Timarandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sutta Devi Pranamami Hari Priye. Jai Shriman Narayana. Very good. Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. I think I recognize pretty much everyone there in Austin, and we have a nice crowd of people here in Omaha as well. What we're going to be talking about today very specifically is the way of the Dharma Warrior. And this is something that a few people have spoken about in the past, mostly from the Buddhist perspective. You know, there's the Shambhala tradition of Vajrayana Buddhism specifically, where they tend to focus on this a little bit, the idea of the Dharma Warrior, coming very specifically from the Kalachakra Tantra tradition in Tibetan Buddhism. But from a Vedic and a yogic context, this is something that is very rarely spoken about. And yet it's something that is very, very important. Let me ask, pretty much everyone here, both in Austin and in Omaha, we're all yogis, correct? We all practice yoga to some degree or another. We practice meditation. This is what I mean by yoga, of course, not necessarily asanas. We practice meditation. We read the Vedic scriptures as much as we can, Bhagavad Gita, Upanishads, etc. We try to practice some sort of systematic spiritual practice in the yogic tradition such that we can elevate ourselves and know the divine. We're yogis. By definition, that's what it means to be a yogi. And yet, interestingly, in the Western world especially, the history of yoga, the actual history of yoga, is actually fully understood by very, very few people. Very few people. You know, I had this one person forward me this silly article that came out recently that's been making the rounds literally a few days ago. This person basically saying that really there is no yoga tradition because many of the modern so-called lineages really only go back a few generations. I was very tempted to write back to the author of this article and tell them just how nonsensical that was, but unfortunately I just don't have the time. And of course what the person was pointing to were false lineages of yoga. Indeed, there are there are a lot of strands of yoga that are no more than 50 years old. However, when it comes to the history of true yoga, of authentic yoga, of Patanjali's yoga system specifically, but then other forms of yoga, you know, because there are many different traditions of yoga, actual traditions. In addition to Patanjali yoga, there's Hatha Yoga in the Vedic tradition. But there's also Jaina yoga, there's also Buddhist yoga, especially in the Tibetan Buddhist form of Buddhism. And we know that these traditions go back many, many, many thousands of years. They have a grand history, and much of that history can be known. Despite even all this, for individuals who know the history of yoga, interestingly, very few people really know the fact that yoga itself, and in fact Sanatana Dharma, is very much aligned with the warrior tradition. You know, in the modern West especially, when we think of yoga, you know, what do we tend to think? Unfortunately, again, we tend to think back to the American 60s, and that's about as far as our memory can take us. You know, we tend to think that yoga is something that was born in America 40 years ago. This is not the case. Yoga as a tradition is much richer than most of us can understand. Now, I want to talk a little bit about very specifically the warrior tradition in yoga, and I don't want to talk about the history aspect too much because I want to go into what does it mean to be a Dharma warrior. But we are going to be talking about this within the context of yoga a little bit. First of all, again, Sanatana Dharma, which is the philosophical basis of all yoga, basically they are synonymous, is itself a warrior tradition. How do we know this? Well, there are several very easy ways that we know this. Let me ask a very simple question. Who has read Bhagavad Gita? Seriously, raise your hand. Who has read Bhagavad Gita? Both here in Austin, pretty much everyone. Who has heard of Bhagavad Gita? Everyone will raise their hand. Okay. Where does Bhagavad Gita take place? In an ashram? In a temple? Perhaps high in the Himalayas, where there is a council of yogis meeting and speaking with each other very peacefully and calmly about high metaphysical subject matters. Takes place on a battlefield where in 3 hours millions of soldiers are about to descend upon each other and kill each other. That's number one. The very context of the most important scripture in the Vedic and in the yogic tradition, interestingly, takes place on a battlefield right before a war. The Mahabharata War, the first world war in history, is about to take place. More than this, who is Krishna speaking to? Krishna being who? Krishna not being, the latest new age healer to come about and try to sell his books on Oprah. Krishna being the avatar, being quite literally the incarnation of God. Who is he speaking to on that battlefield in the Bhagavad Gita? Again, a yogi? No, speaking to a warrior, speaking to a prince, to Arjuna. That's his name. And more. And this is the part especially that really confuses especially Westerners, unfortunately, and it shouldn't. When Arjuna goes into depression and he begins to shake and he drops his bow and his arrows and he says, Krishna, I will not fight. What does Krishna, who is the avatar, the incarnation of God, say to him? Oh, that's very good. It is good to be peaceful, Arjuna, and therefore you should not fight. You're making a very good choice. Interesting, isn't it? How instead Krishna tells him, you must fight. Now, a lot of us, when we read the Bhagavad Gita, when we read it in a yoga context, if we read it in a Bhagavad Gita study group at a yoga center or something, many of us, when we see this, we try to quickly go past it and not think about it too much, and then get into the more philosophical aspects. However, the very context itself of where these profound philosophical teachings are taking place is important. That again, it's on a battlefield, God instructing a warrior and telling him, get up and fight. Arise, Arjuna, he says. Arise. Interesting. This is one thing that's of importance. The other thing that's of importance is that when we look at the avatars, when we look at all of the incarnations of God who come upon the earth, and there are many of them, it's actually said in the scriptures themselves that there are as many avatars as there are waves in the ocean. That's a lot of times that God descends upon the planet in one way or another. Of all these, there are 10 major avatars. Okay? Most of these are what are called kshatriyas. Have people heard this word before? Kshatriya. It means a warrior, a Dharma warrior, very specifically. So I'm telling you this word now because I'll be using it repeatedly. Kshatriya, kshatriya. It means literally a Dharma warrior. That's what a kshatriya is. Interestingly, most of the avatars who come upon the earth are kshatriyas. Is it not interesting that you would think they would be brahmanas? For those who don't know the difference, let me tell you, a brahmana, very specifically, is a person who is more spiritually and intellectually inclined, an individual who is a teacher, etc. A person who is very much in sattva guna, in the mode of goodness. So you would think that when God comes upon the earth, he would always come as brahmanas. He did a few times, but the vast, vast majority of the time, he did not. He came, interestingly, as a Dharma warrior. Rama is one example of this. Narasingha is another example of this. Parashurama is another example of this. Balarama is another example of this. Krishna himself was a kshatriya. Kshatriya by birth, in fact. So most of the avatars were warriors. Okay? More. Let's go maybe slightly, at least in common thinking, I don't agree with this, but in common thinking, we'll go slightly outside of the overt Vedic context. The Buddha. the Buddha, the quote-unquote founder of Buddhism, was of course a yogi. What else was he previous to being a yogi? And really after as well, but especially previous. He was royalty. He was a prince. He was a kshatriya. He was a Dharma warrior. You know? So interesting. Again and again, we start to see these various parallels between on the one hand, these avatars and great teachers and this warrior tradition. Who here has heard of Jainism? Jainism. Pretty much everyone. Very good. Jainism is another small religion that was part of the Vedic tradition at one point. Now it's a little bit distanced from it. They have their own yoga tradition, etc. Who is one of the most important persons in Jainism? In fact, the last Tirthankara, the last individual who was one of their rishis, Mahavira. Mahavira. We've heard of him? He's sometimes called the founder of Jainism, which is inaccurate because we know there were teachers in Jainism previous to him. Well, what does Mahavira mean in Sanskrit?
Great hero.
Great hero. Very good. It means great hero. Is it not interesting that here we have an individual who, if you know the life of Mahavira, he never lifted a sword in his life. You know, that we're aware of, at least according to the texts and to the tradition and according to history. He was not a warrior in the traditional sense and the sense that we tend to think of when we hear that word, warrior, you know. He was someone who, like the Buddha, went very deeply into meditation and practiced tapasya, practiced tremendous austerity, etc., who went very deeply into meditation and who became a liberated being. He was vegetarian. He would not harm anything, anyone, and yet his very name is the great hero. Very interesting. So let's go a little bit deeper into this. What we have seen historically is that the yoga tradition itself was actually formulated by many individuals who either were royalty, who were kings, queens, princes, who were quite literally warriors. And in this case, I mean literally warriors, people who did use weapons, people who did use bow and arrow and swords, etc., etc. So much so that one of the primary names of the yoga system, that is the primary yoga system, Ashtanga Patanjali Yoga, is what? Raja Yoga. Raja Yoga. Why is it called Raja Yoga? There have been two interpretations of this, both of which are correct actually. Because what does Raja mean? Raja means king, or again, a Dharma warrior. Yoga, of course, is yoga. Sometimes people will translate this term, Raja Yoga, as the king of yogas. But truthfully, the compound is created in such a way that you could say that, and that is accurate. But what is also just as accurate to say is the yoga of kings. The yoga of kings. Why is this the case? Well, in prehistoric times, to put it lightly, to put it very, very lightly, in the far, far, far distant past, it was actually understood that the rulers of society, those individuals who were, again, the great warriors, the great Dharma warriors, were individuals who, when they became kings, at a certain point in their life, had to retire. You know, after they had their material existence and after they took care of the state and took care of the people's welfare and did politics, etc., etc., the royalty were expected to, at a certain point in their life, retire and then do what? Yoga, become yogis. Thus, when you look at the history of yoga, when you look at all of the individuals who were great yogis in the Puranas, for example, which are the histories of the world, what you'll find is many of them were retired kings. Many of them were retired royalty. These were the people who practiced yoga and kept yoga alive for generation after generation after generation for many millions of years. More than this, I'm one person who has noticed this, but other scholars have noticed this as well, that interestingly, when yoga itself historically has seemed to be imperiled, That is when yoga lost the interest of the general society and it wasn't being practiced very much. It was always the royalty who revived yoga. Again, a perfect example of this, the perfect example, is the Buddha. You know, many people misunderstand the actual mission of the Buddha. He didn't come here to found a separate religion called Buddhism. At no point in his life did he say this. If you read the original Pali texts, at no point did he say that he was at odds with the Vedic religion that was there. On the contrary, he practiced the Vedic religion all of his life. It was many hundreds of years later that Buddhism finally broke away. But why did the Buddha actually come? Because at that particular time in history, yoga, which is the path for knowing oneself and for knowing the divine, was imperiled. It had become eclipsed by what? Ritual, ritual, ritual. At that particular time, when you had the birth of what's called the Shravaka tradition, the tradition of the forest dwellers, Mahavira being one of them, Gautama, Siddhartha, the Buddha being another one of these individuals. What you had were individuals who were rebelling from their society at the time because everything had become focused upon ritual, 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 and the idea of personal practice and meditation in order to individually know the divine and achieve liberation had all but disappeared. One of the purposes of the Buddha as a Kshatriya, as he was known all his life, a Chakravartin, as a warrior and an emperor of Dharma, one of his missions was indeed to revive yoga. The Buddha was a yogi. He was a yogi. This is why we always see him seated in a yogic position, in Padmasana, meditating. So it's interesting how throughout all of history what we have seen is that it has been the Dharma warriors who have saved yoga again and again from disappearing for one reason or another. Yoga and Dharma warrior tradition historically have always been one. Always been one. Now, this is all very nice and very historical, but what has this have to do with us today? This is something that we need to understand in a very, very practical sort of way. Because how many people here really consider themselves to be warriors in the traditional sense? Probably not many. Maybe a few individuals, but not many people here, when they wake up in the morning until they go to sleep at night, are thinking, oh, I am a warrior, and training themselves in martial arts and weaponry and all these different things. You know, there are a small number of special people for who that is their svadharma, that is their way of being. But for the vast majority of us, including the vast majority of yogis, that's not us. You know, I certainly don't practice with swords every day. You know, I used to a very long time ago when I did study martial arts. But it's not something that the average individual does. So what does this have to do with us as yogis in a spiritual context wanting to make spiritual advancement? If we look at the characteristics very specifically of perfected yogis and of individuals who are Dharma warriors, what we see is that those characteristics are the same. And in understanding these characteristics, we can fully understand ourselves, and we will have the ability to practice spirituality and to practice yoga much better. So I want to talk a little bit about these common characteristics of the yogi and of the kshatriya, the Dharma warrior, a little bit. Okay? So, number one, One characteristic that we see that the yogi traditionally has and that the Dharma Warrior also has. Discipline. Discipline. Without a sense of discipline, it is impossible for us to achieve anything in this world. Without a sense of discipline, is it possible for us, what to speak of being a warrior, is it possible for us to practice yoga on a day-to-day basis? You know, part of what it means to follow a sadhana is that we very often have to make ourselves do something which, in our illusion state, being challenged by the enervating downward pulling motion of this world, we just don't want to do. You know, we see this in children all the time, of course. You know, a child has to study their math, they have to do something, and they just don't want to. And very often that discipline, unfortunately, has to be imposed from outside, from the parent, right? You know? Well, when we become adults, of course, the parent isn't there so much to discipline us, rather we have to discipline ourselves. And for any of us who has achieved anything of great importance in our lives, we know that we couldn't have done it without discipline, whether it was going to school, earning some sort of education degree, having a job that's a little bit challenging. We see this just in everyday life. Well, the truth of the matter is, of course, this translates into spirituality as well. This is why the practice of yoga is called sadhana, discipline. It's a disciplined practice. You know, it's something that very often we'll wake up and some days we feel great and we feel like doing our yoga, we feel like doing our meditation, we feel wonderful and positive. But then there are those days when we will wake up in the morning and it's time for us to do those things that we know are good for us, that will help us to grow. Oh, but we just don't feel like it. It's just one of those days. Oh, I have to do my yoga again today. There's something really good on TV. You know, I haven't seen what's on General Hospital recently. Maybe I should, you know, just this one day maybe. You know, let me just turn on General Hospital. I'll meditate tomorrow. No, this is where the discipline comes in. But of course, we're not children. We are adults. We don't need to be disciplined from outside of ourselves, from external sources. Rather, we discipline ourselves. We tell ourselves, yes, it would be easier and maybe in the short term, seemingly more fun to watch General Hospital. But what does it mean that I don't do yoga today? What does it mean that I don't meditate today? It means that I could have gotten a little bit further toward my goal, but I chose not to. So let me do it. Let me do it. Even though the mayak, the illusioned aspect of myself is telling me not to, I'll make myself anyway. You know, discipline. Next, focus. Focus. Focus is something that every Dharma warrior has to have. It's also something that every yogi has to have. If we have an unfocused mind, is it possible for us to achieve anything in this world? Absolutely not. Because with everything that we attempt to do, our minds will be dragged away into 100 different directions, you know, and we will make no progress toward our goal whatsoever. But then conversely, you know, I have said this in the past, having looked at history. If you look at any great person in history, it doesn't have to be simply a spiritual person, any great political leader, any great religious leader, any great cultural leader, you will be looking at someone who had focus, someone who had the ability to understand, this is my goal, and all of my awareness, all of my attentiveness will be upon that goal and that goal alone in such a way that nothing else exists. You see how this also is meditation. By definition, this is meditation. What do we do when we try to meditate? We have that object of meditation. You know, in our case, very often, mantra, let's say. We focus on the mantra. Om Namo Narayanaaya, Om Namo Narayanaaya. And we focus on that mantra like a laser beam. Why do we not try to meditate while, again, also having the TV blaring and watching TV? Why do we not meditate while also having conversations with 5 different people at the same time? Because we know intuitively that's not focus. I won't be focusing on what I'm supposed to be focusing on such that I will be successful in that meditative awareness. So again, focus, focus, focus is something that is of vast importance, both to the Dharma warrior and to the yogi. Let's go on. Courage, abhaya, fearlessness, fearlessness. We understand this certainly from the Dharma warrior perspective, that a warrior of any sort, of course, has to have courage, has to not fear anything. But this is also a very crucial characteristic to have in the context of yoga as well. This is why in the most important verse of Bhagavad Gita, in chapter 18, verse 66, Krishna says, Ma Shuchaha, as one of his last important instructions to Arjuna. He says, Ma Shuchaha, which, let me ask the people in Austin, what does that mean when Krishna says this? What?
Do not fear.
Do not fear. Do not fear. After 18 chapters of speaking to Arjuna about yoga, about the importance of controlling the mind, about bhakti yoga, about jnana yoga, about karma yoga, about practicing yoga as a meditation within the world while doing action, and on and on. Why is it that toward the very end, Krishna almost ends his instruction to Arjuna by telling him, do not fear? He's saying this in a spiritual context. You see, he's not saying this to Arjuna in a kshatriya context, because obviously as a kshatriya, Arjuna fears nothing. But yet in the spiritual context, Krishna still feels he has to say this to Arjuna. Well, the reason why this is the case is because in the yoga system itself, in meditation, in spirituality, what is one of the very things that we are trying to defeat in our own lives? It's fear. It's fear. Fear of our own mortality, fear of loss, fear of rejection by others, fear of this, fear of that. There is no human being, in fact, there is no living being in existence that does not to some degree fear whatever that object of fear is, except for the yogi. Except for the yogi. The yogi fears nothing. And why? Out of arrogance? No. They fear nothing for one reason. They know that there is nothing to fear, and that they are surrounded at all times by the love of the divine, and that fear itself is an illusion, and that even the object of fear is an illusion. Honor. Honor. Both the yogi and the Dharma warrior have a sense of honor. And what is meant by honor? You know, we hear this word all the time. What honor means, and let me give a spiritual definition of this. What honor means is honesty and authenticity in everything that we do. Very simple. Honesty and authenticity in everything that we do. Thus, in everything that we think, in everything that we say, and in every action that we perform, we do so in an honest manner, being present at the time where we are, not being in a situation pretending to give attentiveness, but our mind is elsewhere, thinking of something else, but rather being present, being honest. When an individual encounters us, we don't present a false face. Rather, what they see is what we are. We present our true selves to them And without what? Without fear. Without fear of showing them who we are within, having nothing to hide. This is honor. Living a life of authenticity, not of fakeness. Living a life of honesty, living a life of goodness, such that we allow our light to shine upon others, unimpeded. That's what it means to be an honorable individual. Living in truth. That when we give our word upon something, when we take a vow to do something, our word means something. Vach. Vach is the Sanskrit word for word itself. And it is understood that when the yogi, just like the kshatriya, just like the warrior, when they give their word upon something, you can trust that word as if it is a contract in writing. This is what we must aspire for, is to be such individuals who are living in truth, not simply speaking about truth. Let's go on. Nobility. Nobility. Nobility not in the class sense, nobility in the character sense. Nobility is another one of these characteristics that both the warrior and the yogi have. And what's meant by nobility? Again, with many of these words, it's important to give a definition. Nobility very simply meaning that in everything that we do, we seek excellence and nothing less. In everything that we do, we seek excellence. We don't look for excuses for why a job was handed to us and we kind of did half the job. We gave it half our effort. No, if we have some duty that we have to perform, if we have something that we are meant to do, if we have something, not merely an assignment given to us by someone else, but something which we have decided is of importance to us that I wish to achieve, that I don't cheat myself either. If I say to myself, my personal goal is to achieve X, let me achieve X. Let me do everything in my power to achieve X, and not half of it. Not just go half the way, 3/4 of the way, and then look for excuses for why I couldn't actually achieve that in my own life. If I have some anartha, if I have some sort of fault or characteristic within me that, having looked within, I don't like, and I want to transcend that, let that be my goal, to transcend that, and do everything in my power to do that fully and completely. When we as spiritual practitioners make the decision that we want to be spiritual beings, and what this means is that we don't want to play games. We know the goal. What is the goal? The goal is absolute moksha, absolute liberation, with everything that that entails. That means ridding myself of illusion. That means ridding myself of fears. That means ridding myself of everything that is not real, and truly knowing who I am and knowing the divine fully. If we say that this is what we want, then what it means to be a noble individual is to work toward that with everything that we have, with every tool that is there at our disposal. This is why yoga is a total system. I've spoken about this many times. This is why with yoga, yoga neglects no aspect of what we are as a human person. You know, what to speak, oh my Lord, what to speak of the people who think that yoga is only physical. No. Yoga is physical, and it's also emotional, and it's also mental, and it's also intellectual, and most of all, it is spiritual. We are meant to use literally every single aspect of who we are, not just one aspect, not just the mind. You see, individuals who love to just read, and they think that that's their spiritual practice. Not just the emotions. People who do nothing but in a very new age kind of way, just allow their emotions to lead them from here to there, like they're a little wisp of cloud just being dragged by the wind in different directions. No, we are meant to use every single aspect of what we are in order to know the divine. And this is why. Is the divine not worth it? And if we don't know that the divine is worth it, then what are we doing? This is why I made this statement in one of my talks, in one of my videos that became famous and at least very well known. And that is something to the effect of spirituality is something that we need to either take seriously or else just leave it alone. We can play with so many things in this world, but spirituality goes to the very core essence of who we are as a living being. Either understand it and practice it fully or just leave it alone. Do something else. Nobility. Very important. What does it mean to be a Dharma warrior today? First of all, it means the courage of being a yogi. The yogi is an outsider. By definition, the yogi is an individual who sees society, who sees all the individuals in society and what they are doing. They see that most people in society basically just want to do what they are told. They want to just kind of go along with the culture, whatever the culture is and whatever the culture is saying them, not make waves, not seem different. Just be materialistic, pursue all the things that materialistic society is telling them that they are supposed to pursue, not think about anything higher, and just be left alone. That's the majority of individuals. That's the mainstream. But then, of course, what's that little countercurrent? Those are the few individuals, that minority of individuals who stand out because they see what is happening in society around them. But instead of just fitting in, on the contrary, it makes them uncomfortable. It gives them a disquiet within their very beings, such that they know that, yes, even though the media and educational institutions and etc., is telling me that this is what my life should be, I know that there is something higher. And even if it means that I have to look different from other people, I will pursue that higher, no matter what. I will pursue that higher, even if society thinks I'm a weirdo because I do yoga. Even if society thinks I'm a weirdo because I've decided to be vegetarian when most people want to go to steakhouses. I have decided that even though the vast majority of society can't even begin to understand what meditation is, and they want to look for distractions 24 hours a day, my goal is to do the opposite. My goal is that I am in joy when I am in silence and focusing and communing on the divine. This is the yogi. We must not fool ourselves. We are the ultimate minority. We are the ultimate minority group. And as a result, it takes courage to be a true yogi. It takes courage. It takes detachment. It takes all of these qualities that we were talking about. So, how do we be a Dharma warrior today? Precisely this. Be a yogi. Be a yogi. Be a yogi. That's number one. Number two, live in the world but be not of the world. This is something we've heard in many different spiritual traditions. What we are meant to do individually is to fully engage ourselves in the world. Whether we are students, whether we are professors, whether we're radio hosts, whether we're doctors, whether we're Ayurvedic practitioners, whatever we are, business people, we are meant to be within the world, doing our activities, but at the same time living our lives in such a way that internally we have transcended the world, on the one hand. On the other hand, living our lives also in such a way that as a result of our own spiritual attainment, people see our example and themselves want to become spiritual. Finally, and then this is the last thing I'm going to say about this, about how do we be a Dharma warrior today, very specifically, in 2014, and in America. We have to save the world. It has got to be one of our greatest desires that when we look around us and when we see individuals who are in suffering, when we see that we are in a world where there is so much pain, both externally, both physically, and people starving, etc., but in America especially that internal pain, when we look around us and we see that people are depressed, that people are unhappy, that we see that people are roaming around with this sense of hopelessness around them, where they feel they can't trust anyone, and they feel that they're living in a harsh world, which honestly it has become a harsh world. What we are to do is to help those individuals. You see, in this way we are being a warrior. Because what in the dharmic sense is a warrior? And now this is where it all comes to fruition. You see, there is a warrior, but then there is what we are talking about, a Dharma warrior. See, a warrior is anyone with a gun who is trained to kill and who is fighting in an organized manner. That's a warrior. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a Dharma warrior. And the difference between the two is this. The Dharma warrior gives of themselves courageously in order to uphold truth, in order to uphold Dharma. And what does that mean? That means that in every circumstance we do our best to eliminate the opposite of Dharma. And what is the opposite of Dharma? What I was just talking about. Fear, depression, anxiety, hopelessness, meaninglessness. When we ourselves experience this, or when we have friends or others who we know, who we see are experiencing pain, troubles, suffering, what they are experiencing is the opposite of Dharma. They are experiencing the opposite of the natural. Because it is our natural essence to be in bliss. It is our natural essence to experience joy. It is our natural essence to experience happiness. Thus, when we are experiencing the opposite of that, what are we experiencing? The opposite of the natural. The opposite, in other words, of Dharma. The Dharma warrior wages war against adharma, the opposite of Dharma. That is the definition of the Dharma warrior. And again, what does that mean today? No guns, no bow and arrow, no sword. We as Dharma warriors are meant to go wherever we see the opposite of Dharma, wherever we see suffering, and we are meant to bring that to a close as much as we are capable as individuals. Now, having said all this is a very high aspiration, isn't it? Am I saying we all have to be acharyas now? We all have to be gurus? No, this is not meant to scare people into responsibility. Oh, what is Acharyaji saying? we all have to become these grand gurus now. No, it means whoever we are, wherever we find ourselves in our lives, with whatever talents we have, with whatever realization we have as an individual, just share that. If you have a lot, if you have a little. If you've been practicing this path for 40, 50 years, if you've been practicing it for 6 months, whatever goodness you have experienced, whatever light you have within you, bestow that grace upon others to whatever degree you can. In 2014, that's being a Dharma warrior. The Dharma warrior is one who conquers through love.